played into Virginia quite a bit.
Yeah, it became a commodity that was really one of our most major exports. And I always use the analogy, if you think of 19th century America, when we cornered the steel market in the late 1800s, or it happened first with flour. And one of the first areas or markets that American colonies shipped flour to is the Caribbean, because those are sugar islands and they needed foodstuffs. And in fact, not just flour, but cornmeal was shipped and even baked bread. And so as soon as the colonies had a surplus of grain, which depending on the colony, 1680s to 1700, they're looking for those markets. And then of course, rum and sugar and the trade in enslaved peoples comes back. So that was a very important market for the colonies, but also Southern Europe. And Portugal and Spain become a big market for American flour. And once we get a toehold there, it's such good flour, we continue to grow through the 19th century. So the Lees, we don't have all the records there, but they certainly could have been tapped into that flour trade. And keep in mind, there's also intercolonial trade. So, Washington even referred to the northeastern states as the fish and meat states, even though they had grains. So the mid-Atlantic and up to Philadelphia and Delaware, and then later up into New York, are really a breadbasket of which, without those foodstuffs, the tobacco culture, the tobacco wealth that built Virginia would not have taken place. And someone had asked a question already about how much the local population trading, bringing grain to Stratford Mill. And that was another part of the economy besides export, was you would bring your grain as a local person to the closest mill, or maybe the miller that you liked best, because there were mills everywhere. And they would weigh it and grind your grain and take a toll. 1/6 or 1/8 of the grain was the price. You'd pull your wagon around to the back of the mill and load up that, and then you could use it at home or take it to market yourself. But later on, larger mills developed that are merchant mills, where if you wanted to just unload your whole crop, you could go to a large merchant mill and say, I'm selling you my all wheat crop. Then as a farmer, you don't have to worry about it anymore. You're paid. And then I wanted to go back a little bit to the film. When we were inside, of course, we started the mill by,
right.
The controls there, the water wheel and all, you saw that working. And we both had our hands in the flour there in the sifter, which is the ultimate test, right? You want to feel how it's coming off the stone. And that top stone's adjustable. So one of those levers, that way I can control the coarseness or fineness. So, often when we talk and I'm grinding something out, different grain, I'll say, how do you want that? Do you want it fine, medium fine? You want it super fine? And then we dial it in. And that's amazing, that old wooden machine. You can dial that stone in perfectly. And then, of course, we ended up at your lovely oven. And having been around it a while, it's really, maybe you ought to talk just briefly about the history of these ovens in colonial America and what you do with yours.
Yeah, sure. So my oven, it's a clay oven. Some people refer to it as an earth oven or a cob style oven, as the English called it. But basically those types of ovens, they were popular from New France as early as like the 16th century, the whole way down to the Carolinas and Georgia. That oven in particular is based after an oven in Georgia of a settlement of Austrian Lutherans that actually escaped rule in Austria at the time. They were sponsored by England, and they came over to Georgia, just northwest of Savannah, and they settled, and they actually had 3 grist mills that they set up and a series of these ovens. And that's where the description from mine came from. Somebody in the 19th century saw one still standing, which is amazing at that point of view, because the reason why there aren't a lot of ovens left from colonial America is because, they're built of earth. They're built of earth, and they weren't covered quite properly, or the weather got to them, and they didn't last as long. They did what they needed to do, and then when other ovens got introduced, they sort of faded to the past. So that oven in particular is more of a southern coastal Virginia to about coastal Georgia. Even though they pop up in New France and even in New England, the materials change with the changing of terroir. So mine is made of like kind of that brownish red clay. So sort of familiar to the Georgia, South Carolina area. In Virginia, they would be a tad more red. Over time, they would weather. And then in New England, you'd even have some brick. And actually, even in Virginia, too, as early as like the 1740s and 50s, you start to see a lot of brick in the inside. Recently, I came across a lot of archival stuff with the brickmaker at Williamsburg in his account books building ovens out of brick, but they were also covered with clay. But on the inside, they were just stacked and stacked of bricks. And they say, you know, how many bricks they made, you know, it was like 6,000, 7,000 bricks to build an oven. And it's just unbelievable. But basically, yeah, it's, mine's made of clay and there's mortar in it because I travel with it. So it would, if it wasn't have mortar in it, it actually wouldn't travel that well and it'd probably be on the side of 95 somewhere, which is not a very funny thing to think about.
Wouldn't want that to happen to that amazing oven.
No, but yeah, that's very popular and it was very used even in the early records of Virginia, the Virginia Company. They were building community ovens as early as the early 17th century. It was required as part of the statutes that there be an oven built.
Well, and then as we were outside talking about that, the other aspect that the grains tie to is your research with grains and what that means practically for a baker, because it's just like with whiskey or beer, there's a lot of people using heirloom grains today, getting back to the past, and that's a different flavor profile completely than the modern wheats or corns or rye. So when we were outside and we were breaking bread together, literally, you talked a little bit about that flavor profile, but it's also about how you prepare the you know, your batch, because I think it behaves differently than other grains, doesn't it, in your dough box?
Yeah, it does. I mean, you're exposed to all, I mean, I'm exposed to all outside weather, and so is that dough. You know, depending on if it's a community bakehouse of that time, if it's a separate, you know, from the house bakehouse, is it a bakehouse that's, you know, attached to a hearth? But speaking as an oven close to my standards, that clay oven outside, you're exposed to all elements. And, you know, humidity can affect, you know, bakers today. I mean, you know, there's a significant amount of temperature control. And, you know, for them, I think they might, you know, have a panic attack, you know, when they're making bread outside, because there's all these things that you can't control. And doing that, I mean, you sort of you feel like what somebody would have felt like making bread back then, because back then they weren't making it for, you know, they were making it for sustenance. They were making it to eat. They were making it to survive and live. It wasn't quite for flavor. It wasn't for, you know, a crumb shot of, you know, the bread cut in half and posted pictures of it. It's more of sustenance. So, and that's the way I like to treat it too, because I like to eat bread and I like to eat good bread. And I don't really care, you know, what too much it looks like, but, you know, the flavor profiles of it are unbelievable, because this is before we were actually breeding and selecting things for flavor. This is way before that. This is selecting to, you know, prevent rust and prevent total crop failure, so you could actually pay for things, because, you know, wheat was also it was also traded for goods. You know, it was also for even like Washington, and I'm sure for the Lees as well, it was traded for bought goods to a merchant. So, you know, there's some things that they just weren't choosing it for. And back then it wasn't for flavor, but when you look at it from a perspective of today, that things are selected for flavor and things are selected and bred for, you know, for color consistency, for moisture content, for all these things, it kind of like, oh, this bread actually tastes really, really good because it hasn't been messed with. And it kind of, it's even with the milling part too, because, you know, a lot of people think that 18th century breads, which some of them were, depending on what class you were or what class, you were buying for. The wheat was, completely sifted with silk bolding cloths, or it was, the bran wasn't separated at all, and you were combining that back in to eat, similar to like with the horse bread I was talking about. And then there's like household flour, which is like the bran that's like put back in the bread, so they can sell the flour for cheaper. But all those things really, really matter. So it actually depends on what class you were, on what kind of bread you were eating. And the better thing is, like, the lower class, the people, they were probably eating more nutritious bread.
Yep.
Because there was less taken out of it.
Yep.
So, and that applies to a lot of things as well.
Well, like the bolted flour you mentioned, that in the larger merchant mills, they have a large reel that's driven by the water wheel. It's in a large 15-foot long box called a bolting chest, and that would grade the flour into 2 grades, but also remove the bran, because the export market wanted what was called superfine flour. And then the next grade, there's a lot of names for middling flour. There's different tailings. Some bolters had many sections, but they often called that second grade fine flour. And we know from my area of Virginia that the bran was often used for sending in for ship's biscuit, which was a hardtack. So they didn't waste anything. But in a country mill, in a rural area, they may have a bolter, but sometimes you got your flour right out of the spout. If you sifted anything, it was done at home. And that's true of the European windmills. You often see, it depends on the country, but they certainly had sifting machines. In England, they called it a wire machine. It's much smaller, different than a bolter, but it got the fine sift. But a lot of times, like the Dutch windmills, they just catch it in a sack and you take it home. So I think, again, it breaks down by culture, but also socioeconomic status. But at your oven too, the other thing that was interesting, as I learned from you, is like, you get your fire going in there, but you have to clean that whole inside of the oven out of the wood, right? You mop that down, and that thing holds so much heat for you to then get your loaves in there.
Yeah, basically, and this will bring up another point from another mill that wasn't too far away, is Robert Carter's mill at Nominee Hall. He actually had the bakehouses, that were 3 of them, attached to his merchant mill, so he could bake biscuits and barrel them pretty much all on the same day, and pack them and ship them. And the thing is that kind of watching and separating those bakehouses and doing some archival research on it, he states in there that you can get 100 loaves per fire, which is dead on to what my oven gets. And I didn't really know that at the time, like how many loaves can I bake before, the fire goes out, before it's not hot enough, because what I'm doing is I'm heating that oven up for anywhere from, if I'm baking that day, it's 4 to 5 hours, or even if I'm starting the fire the night before, and I'm firing it for 16, 17 hours. And then I pull everything out. I pull all the ashes. I pull basically all the fire out, and I sweep it, and then I mop it. And what happens when you mop it is, like I said in the video, if it was kind of hard to hear, but it coats the top of the oven, that layer of steam from you mopping it. And it also does this when the bread is releasing steam inside the oven when the door's closed. And what it does is it coats the top of the oven, and then it comes back down and it cloaks the loaves, and it really brings out the sugars in the bread. And that's what causes the browning of it. So it's quite crazy, but literally I think 120 loaves is like the max. And that's like the last batch, probably taking an hour and 20 minutes or so. Usually a batch of 20 to 22 loaves would take anywhere from 46 to 50 minutes. And that's with the oven being at 600 degrees when I open the door.
I have a question for you, 2 questions. One really important. Why didn't you make 100 loaves last week? I'm a little upset about that because the bread was so good. I would have been gigantic at the end of the week, but that bread was phenomenal. The second thing I want to do is I want you guys to take a moment to answer some of these questions. We've got some great questions from our attendees. So you guys, can you see the questions, Justin?
Yep.
So go ahead and maybe start at the top and just kind of start knocking them out. But I would love to answer some of these or have you all answer them because I do not have the answers for most of these things.
Well, I think we talked a little bit about the other local people using mills, so there were hundreds of mills in the Northern Neck. So again, if you didn't like Mill A or the miller, you could go 5 miles the other way. And again, it was toll milling where you'd bring your harvest to that local mill. Family flour in the 19th century, that you do see that on orders and sometimes bags. There's a lot of different terms for that Midland medium flour that we would call whole wheat maybe today, but depending on how the sifting does, there's gradations there. So there's a lot of interchangeable terminology. But Justin, I don't know what you think there, but I would think the family flour would have been that Midland flour, that medium fine, not the higher end kind of pastry flour.
Yeah, family flour, like in the 19th century, you'll see that, and it's kind of interchangeable with 18th century, like household flour, what was common. I mean, that was a kind of thing that was even used. You see it in the record books at Mount Vernon, them seeing like middling flour being used for the house or household flour. So yeah, that's basically what that is. A little bit of the brand folded back in, probably somewhere between like 20 and 30%. So like, about a medium fine.
Yeah. And we did have another volume question on the conversation, Kelley, if you can manipulate that at all for Bruce, who was having trouble hearing the conversation, and he's at full volume on his computer. The major differences between Stratford and Mount Vernon mills is they're 18th century mills, but they're in two eras of technology because in a sense, there's the country mill or the toll mill, which Stratford was. Doesn't mean it didn't export a little bit, but Washington builds a merchant mill, which is much larger. Actually, Washington had an earlier mill he inherited that was much like Stratford mill. It would have been more for the local consumption. And then when he gets out of tobacco, as the cash crop switches to grains, he's going to export flour. He builds a larger mill with a more powerful wheel, larger millstones, and all the equipment to sift. And then, of course, later he installs the Oliver Evans system, which is a whole nother topic, but that was an automated system with bucket elevators and a hopper boy, a flour cooler that allowed the mill to do continuous milling. And Evans owns US Patent 3. So if you ever want to Google Oliver Evans and read on that. But basically, Washington's mill was a larger merchant mill. And Benjamin says, I love the rye whiskey from Mount Vernon, so thank you. And we will be talking a little bit about brewing and whiskey as we go through this. Now, Justin, you've done research on the letters between Washington and Richard Henry Lee, and I've read some of them too. I don't know if they talked a lot about milling, but they certainly talked about farming, as well as, of course, the events of the day. I know you've been into that recently.
Yeah, they exchanged quite a bit. Not so much on milling and designs, but more on farming. And then, as you get kind of closer, coming up on the Revolution, discussing that. But honestly, I think there's more of a connection with grains, especially between Light Horse Harry Lee and Washington. And that comes into play with the barley. Light Horse Harry Lee was the first one to give Washington a naked Italian barley, which naked referring to there's no hull on it. So you don't have to hull it. You can go straight to grinding it. They did have a machine, I think in the 1790s, that was invented, like a hulling machine, to remove that hull from other varieties of barley. But this one in particular, he was quite fond of because it didn't have the hull on it. And actually, you also see some exchange between Light Horse Harry Lee and Washington with corn and also rye later on when they're talking about distilling. I know
Washington was trying to get some rye from different suppliers.
Yeah.
And he asked Lighthorse about it.
Yeah, he did, because I think, to be honest with you, I don't think he was having much success growing it. So he was buying it from quite a few places, including like Maryland and other parts of Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Well, that same question, he did ask that Richard Henry Lee, that they visit each other's houses. I don't know if Washington was ever at Stratford, but I do know Richard Henry Lee was at Mount Vernon. I do know that Washington stayed at Sabin Hall, Landing Carter's home, not far from Stratford. And also him and Lighthorse Harry Lee were close, because he was Lighthorse was Light Dragoons commander under Washington, the great victory at Paulshoek. And I think he relied on him a lot during the war. And of course, Lighthorse's great eulogy for Washington is always one that we remember: first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. So I think Lighthorse is really an unsung hero. There's a lot about him. We could go into him for an hour.
Future program.
Yeah, future program is right. But there was a couple of interesting things here about trade. And someone asked about millstones, just real briefly. Millstones come in all shapes and sizes and are quarried in various places in the world. So there was a lot of different selection. In America, they imported a lot of stones early on because they just didn't have quarries established here. But they did bring over like Derbyshire Peak stones, which were sandstone grit, which is soft, great grinding for grinding barley. But the key stone, like the one set we were kneeling by in the mill, were the French burr stones. And those were freshwater quartz from the Marne River. So there was a lot of different options for a miller, and shapes and sizes depending on the water power, the size of the mill, the gear ratios. And basically what a mill with two sets would do is grind the local market corn on a domestic stone and do export work on the finer French stone. And as far as rotations, the wheel and stone make, it depends on gear ratios. To get a little technical, Stratford's gear ratio is 9.34 to 1, which so rounded up for one revolution of the water wheel, it's 10 of the stone. So, you just, depending on how fast you run it. Now this salt and grain trade question is really interesting from Lucas, because I do know that when flour went to Portugal and Spain, one of the things Washington did was, of course, bring back Madeira, like everybody did. But there was salt there that was higher quality that he can get in the New World, and he commented on that. So that was very important. You have your salt in that time period.
Yeah, also on that question that Lucas asked about the grain, a lot of in the early 1730s and 40s, the grain trade was operating through Arles, France, and that actually was the basis of where all grain came from, or through, so to speak, because a lot of it was coming from eastern regions and also Fertile Crescent areas, but it would be priced and weighted and shipped out of Arles, France, and that's also flour, with spelt, and with einkorn. A lot of those things, and even rice, they were all coming through there. But we had a thing called the French and Indian War in the 1750s happened that sort of cut off our trade from Arles. And then we had to rely on other things outside of Arles, so cut around ways through England. And then in the 1770s, we had this thing called the Rev War, and that sort of messed up trade. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the colonies had to rely upon themselves for growing the grains. And that was like an introduction to, we need to support ourselves because we can't ship everything everywhere else. We actually need to feed ourselves. And that was like a big thing between the difference between, Washington and Jefferson. Jefferson wanted to, he was kind of an idealist, and he wanted to feed people through ideas, and Washington just wanted to feed people without getting too political.
I love that. I love that. We're getting some really good questions here too. Definitely the ones you need to answer, but there's some real technical foodie questions towards the end of this Q&A. So let's keep working through these. Justin, do you want to talk about where you go, where you travel, how to taste your delicious bread?
Yeah, so things got majorly, of course, with everybody with this pandemic, but I will be at Mount Vernon in mid-September. I think it's September 19th and 20th, where I'll have my bread and cakes and things of sort. And that's pretty much it for the rest of the fall. A lot of demos here and there. If you ever make your way to Charleston, I do farmers markets when I'm not traveling to historic sites. But I will post a sort of mock schedule on my website, which is halfcrownbakehouse.com. And you can check out where I'm at and where I'm going to. And I'll go ahead and answer another question. My oven was actually, I had it built. I helped do the design and a little bit of the building, but it was done in Charleston, South Carolina. And I get my flint corn from a place called Anson Mills. They're probably the largest grower slash mill situation owned by Glenn Roberts that does period correct grains from, period strains. And a lot of those are actually shipped whole grain up to Steve, whether he be at Stratford or Mount Vernon Mill. And some of those are ground on site right before my events, which makes super good for. But all the flint corns you can get from Glenn on ansonmills.com.
And Justin, a Colonial baker, another gentleman, Jeff, wanted to know more about the spelt in the bread, if you could elaborate.
Yeah. So that spelt, that's also from Anson Mills. I made that variety of bread just because the leaves were documented in growing spelt. That spelt in particular is of provenance in northern Italy, and then it was grown in colonial America and Virginia and Pennsylvania. I like to actually mix more of those grains to be more of like that horse bread that we talked about with like the spelt and the oats and the wheat chisel and all those brands to sort of make it a wholesome bread. But the spelt, honestly, I think it gives it a toasted flavor. It's not like, very, very normal bread where it's just like, oh, it kind of has that air about it, like, oh, it's when it's toasted, it's really good. But the spelt, the maltiness in it kind of really attests to the flavor. And also it slows down my ferment, especially when it's 90 plus degrees outside, and I can have spelt sort of cool things down a little bit. And I think Jeff also asked another, the 50% water, the hydration level, it is a super thick dough. Ship biscuits, I've made those before, and I know Jeff has made those before too. Those are very dense, so to speak. This bread does have a little bit of air pockets, kind of due to the fermentation, but it is a super thick dough, especially when you're mixing like 80 to 90 loaves worth. It's kind of tough to work with, but it's also based on not, so to speak, an actual recipe, but a series of ratios that I've kind of read and sort of done a little bit of like culinary archaeology, so to speak. Sort of wrote down like, hey, like if they say this in a book and I know myself and I'm more of a feel person, I'm not quite like, oh, I'm going to measure this out. And I know they probably weren't measuring that out either. So to that dialect, it's just, it's more of a feel for me. And the way that I read some of those books, some of the older ones, and some of even the manuscripts, it's, mixed till it's a stiff dough, mixed till it's a stiff dough. You see that over and over again. And I kind of played with it, and when it felt stiff to me, that's when I kind of cut off my water, and that's how I was measuring my water.
Can you answer a question from Linda? What size, weight are the loaves? What kind of wood is is the mill? That's a Steve question. And same quartz stone can grind wheat and corn, ? Is corn much harder?
For the size and weight, Linda, so the size is 1 pound, 13 ounces, give or take a couple ounces. I'm pretty good by feel now, but that weight, especially in Charleston and South Carolina, they had statutes of bread sizing. So basically, it put the weight of flour, and that's what they charged for a loaf of bread. And it wasn't so, only rich people could afford bread. It was more so everybody could afford bread. It was done that way. And actually, bakers would stamp their loaves on the bottom. So if they were selling it for more money due to the weight, they'd have inspectors come by and they'd see whose stamp it was, and then you would get a fine. But my loaves are 1 pound, 13 ounces because in Charleston, that was the most common loaf, was a 1 pound, 13 ounce loaf. So just a touch under 2 pounds, heavy enough to, feed somebody back then for probably a day. Now it seems like maybe a week or two, you can't finish a loaf.
Well, the wood of the mill is really 2 or 3 types. The water wheel is made of white oak. The main shaft, the wooden shaft, that's the axle, is white oak. The inside where the gears sit, they sit in a timber frame structure that's white oak. And then the gears themselves, the circles are white oak. But the gear teeth, which are called cogs, and the rounds that are in the other gear are rock maple or northern maple. Although I've seen locust used for that purpose as well. So a lot of good indigenous hardwoods. The gear teeth will wear out through time, and you just replace teeth. And then every so many years, a mill's going to have to get a new water wheel. But white oak is just so strong, mechanically strong, and it's tight grained, which is good for that water wheel. And then inside you got floorboards and casings around the stones that are pine, and so lighter woods. And then the other question was the millstones. Well, the freshwater quartz is so hard. The French stone is so hard. It's going to rip up any grain you run through it, and so it would take care of corn or wheat just fine. The reason I think the French stone got a reputation was the pits that are in the stone. It tends to have little pits in it, and it's so hard that it stayed sharper longer. Millstones are grooved, and the little air pockets that were there in the nature of that stone being pitted helped to cool the flour before it came down. I'm not saying cool it tremendously, but if you, like even at Mount Vernon's mill, when we're running that French stone hard, I could put my hand in the flour and it's warm. And so you don't want to sift it when it's warm for obvious reasons. So that French stone got that really a reputation. So they first quarried them in the 13th century. So it kind of became like what we call branding today. And you can see bags in 19th century mills where they advertise French burrs. The thing is, not all of them were French, because there's a Georgia stone that's very close to the French burr, and also the Ohio chert, which is close. So again, buyer beware, but it was a very good stone, and that's what people preferred to do the flour on. Someone asked about spoilage of flour, and I think Justin and I both know, it's going to go bad. There's no preservatives in it. So, that was one of the amazing things about American export flour, that it made it to different places and was most of it always in great shape. And some of that's in the packing, how they packed it in the proper conditions. Like on a hot July day at Stratford Hall, you're not wanting to put the lid on that flour barrel and put it in the hold of a ship. It's not going to survive good. But that amazed the European markets that we could make such high quality flour and it didn't spoil.
And a question too from Gina, second question was, have you ever milled flaxseed into linseed oil?
No, but there's specialized mills for that called oil mills. And I've seen them running in Germany and Holland. And actually the German immigrants to Virginia in the later period, or, 1840s, there's one example of a water-powered mill that has grain on one side and stampers and presses to press linseed oil. So you have to crush the seed first and then heat it, which they have little pans to do that. And then it's put into a press that's compressing that to squeeze the oil out. So I'd say go to the Netherlands. You can see a lot of linseed oil mills still running.
Got a question here from H. Gilbert Smith. Could you comment on bread recipes, wheat, water, starter, corn, rye, oil, and he says molasses, which makes me think of that butter that you made, which you should probably mention at some point because it's quite heavenly. So go ahead.
Yeah, so the bread like you're referring to is probably the New England classic, like thirded bread, which was sort of common between colonies, but more so in the New England, Boston area, that contained molasses, cornmeal, and rye. And sometimes it was referred to as like Indian bread. But yeah, so that mixture of wheat, rye, and corn, and actually the term thirded bread is because it was like equal parts of each grain. But recently, I've found a few bakers that run advertisements in Boston in the 1720s that they find that, and I can actually relate to this as well because I've made thirded bread following thirded bread instructions, that the amount of wheat is heavier on their end. It's almost like half and quarter. So it's like half wheat and a quarter part rye and a quarter part corn. And then you add your molasses. And usually beer barm was used. Like most people think of older breads, they think of starter being used as sourdough, but fully developed sourdough wasn't quite as popular because they thought things that were sour were bad for their stomach. Obviously, nowadays, we know that things that are sour are good for our stomach. So in relation to that, also there's a bread referred to as like soldier's bread, and that's pretty much dead on minus like the molasses of wheat, rye, and corn, usually because wheat was too expensive or it was so not easy to get as armies are traveling through, or they might have had a bad season of wheat, but like rye or corn, usually there wasn't bad seasons for that. Wheat usually contained most rust and drought and ran into most things like that. But when I make like a thirded bread, I follow that baker's ad in Boston, and I do 50% wheat. I do cornmeal, which is usually a Flint variety. I find it more flavorful, and it actually it's a little denser and moister. In the same way with rye. Rye, it's just one of those things where varieties weren't quite the thing, and I know Steve will attest to this. Looking for 18th century varieties of rye is like looking for a needle in a stack of needles. There was just a lot of things that were grown wild. There was also a lot of open pollination when it came to rye and wheat. So, rye, there are a few varieties, especially in coastal areas, that came about in the late 18th century, early 19th century. But yeah, that's on that. I hope that answers that well.
Let's talk about the workings there a little bit, a phrase that you taught me last week. But the next question is, why doesn't the starter dough left in the wooden bowl grow mold and bacteria? Is it just used quickly?
Yeah, so most of the time turning it over pretty quick. I mean, if it's in a baking firm situation, which would more be, like in cities, you're making 2 to 3 batches a day, and then overnight, it's really nothing is going to happen to it overnight. But there's also, a lot of pests that can get into bakeries back then. They didn't have airtight doors back then. There's a lot of things that could get in, but obviously that wasn't a giant concern. But today, more than likely, like when I do this, I have my dough box that I use more than the dough bowl. And the box itself kind of creates almost a really young starter inside that. And what I'll do is I'll put water in there so it'll kind of hydrate it a little bit before I mix in the morning. So it kind of stiffens up, and you can almost scrape it and dry it out. So it's almost like a crude version of yeast.
Heather asks, the type of bread that was created, was it similar to the type of Tuscan hard bread as a means for storing it for a long periods of time?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, there's kind of two answers to this. One, since we were going to eat that bread that day, it's not as dried out in the center. It's still got a nice moist crumb to it, even though it's dense. But back then, I mean, especially during, when people are shipping biscuits and actually shipping and barreling bread, you wanted a hard bread. You wanted something to be so dried out that it would last a long time, especially when we're talking about like the American Revolution. Washington was very, very stern that he only wanted hard bread. I think somebody made soft bread one time, and he just wasn't having it because it wouldn't travel well. The good thing about hard bread is it can't be stale enough, because then one, it doesn't go moldy, there's no moisture, and two, you can pour hot water and your whiskey ration over top of it and have yourself a meal. So it kind of served two purposes. But yeah, it is kind of like that bread, but we I don't cook it as long because I still want that moist. I don't dehydrate the bread in my oven. You can do that for a longer time, and for like ship biscuits, it works great because they do last a long time. I mean, I made some for display like 7 years ago, and they still have not molded. So that tells you how long that they last.
We got a question from William. What is the flour extraction rate for the bread being discussed? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so the price on that assize bread was for the household. So probably 70% extracted. There's still bran in there, but it isn't the pure super fine that was almost 100%, and it wasn't middling. It was somewhere in between super fine and household. Household flour was the price that was on.
All right, ready for the next one from Linda again. Linda's a friend of mine on Facebook. What wood is the hopper?
I think some of the furniture, the hopper may be poplar. A lot of that stuff on mill furniture can be a variety of woods. At Mount Vernon, it's clear yellow pine.
Carol Bean asks, are you aware of John Brown in Philadelphia who produced French burrstones? We already sort of talked about that a little bit. Any info you can share with us?
No, I'm not. I'd like to look into him, and he would have been one of those stone dealers like Oliver Evans was, where a lot of times the French stones were shipped over as sections that were then put together with gypsum as mortar and iron banding and the different hardware the millstone needs. So there were people that dealt in millstones that would have gone down to the port, and those stones were often used as ballast in the bottom of a ship, and they would sell them to the millstone maker who takes them to their shop to put all the hardware on them and put them together, and from there it goes to different mills. So I imagine that's what you mean, Carol, that John Brown was likely a dealer in French burrstones, and it's somebody definitely I'll look up. But I do know that Oliver Evans dealt in them too, and Evans also sold bolting cloths, bolting silks that were the Dutch made some of the best, and later the English did too.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to look into him as well. But so many connections too with Philadelphia and Virginians. It's a very close-knit community.
Well, Washington used to get, after the presidency, he got porter beer from a brewery in Philly that he loved. And there's a great letter where the guy procuring it for him says, I'm sorry to report the brewery is burned down.
Oh, yeah, the Lees have a lot of strong connections in Philadelphia too. Amy Colony just straight up says the best butter. So can you just talk about that butter for 1 second before we get back into these other questions?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the butter that I serve sometimes with the bread slices that I do at events, it's it's somewhat based upon rations during the Revolutionary War, where butter was included, salt pork, and molasses was also on that list. And I wanted to give people a better, well, maybe a tastier perspective of what that mixed with bread, like in one dish. You know, if you boiled the salt pork, if you had some molasses and you had this, you know, hard bread, what all that would taste like. And it came out a very delicious spread for bread. I mean, I didn't want it quite to be that delicious, but it you know, I'm sure it didn't taste like that. But it is a good combo to express like those flavors, like the saltiness of the pork back then, the sharpness because it's crude molasses, the sharpness of the molasses, and also, you know, the kind of the crustiness of the bread. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to answer other questions. Okay, so from William, was there, how do you pronounce that? Maslin? My pronunciation tonight is failing. Flour in your area? If so, do you have any idea what the rye-wheat ratio might have been commonly?
Yeah, so that's like the mixture of rye and wheat.
Okay.
And I have not come across that yet in anything. It might be later in the 19th century, but I have not seen anything 18th century in the colonies or even earlier than that. But yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting mix of things that I will probably look into a little deeper, but I don't think it's involved in my time period of the 18th century.
Do you want to touch on the sourdough thing? Being someone from the San Francisco Bay Area, sourdough is near and dear to my heart, and we were having a conversation about sourdough last week, which I thought was pretty interesting. I know you're not completely done with your research on it, but do you want to touch on sourdough for a moment here?
Yeah, so when I say sourdough, I do not mean that as a very common thing in the 18th century, but there are oral histories from the enslaved communities that have sort of arisen in the past couple of years. Not a lot of documentary evidence on it, but the term working as the dough left over to be applied the next day, and those being rolled over a period of time, that they were rolled back in as like an early sourdough type. And I think honestly, maybe that term sourdough, I think that they were making it somewhat, they just didn't call it that.
That makes sense. All right, from Lucas, were there any notable flour explosions in the period? Mills, or did they manage? I'm sorry, this weird Zoom thing where it doesn't merge words, managed to avoid that risk. Oh boy.
Well, there was certainly the danger of flour explosion in mills, and you know, and I've read a few accounts, but I think they're not as prevalent as we think today. You know, of that time period. You know, you look at these mills, lots of windows, lots of ventilation. The real issue with mills is the injuries and things I've seen comes from people getting caught in gears. And then I've read some accounts recently out of England in the 19th century, and I never dawned on me, but millstones can wear out and fracture. And if you think of a stone that's built in parts, I found accounts of, you know, millstones running 100 RPM, and then the newspaper report says the stone fractured and threw hunks of the stone through the wooden casing and killed the miller or maimed his apprentice. So, you know, around that heavy machinery, anything like that can happen. You know, people have gotten hurt in water wheels and fact, I was at a mill in Scotland some years ago, and it was a lady miller who was very good. And she said a family came to visit one summer with their grandmother, and the grandmother was sitting by the water wheel, and the kids were playing, and they'd known that she had several siblings, but they didn't know where the grave of her little brother was, who died when he was young. And the sound of the water wheel, this 90-year-old woman all of a sudden says, Jimmy fell in that wheel. And the memory came back of it had happened when at some other mill that when they were kids. So I think the force of the water, the gearing, the millstones are your real danger. But like with distilling, you know, fire's a big hazard, and, you know, you get even a grain storage situation, you can have explosions. So, you know, that's why you think of millers working in dark conditions. You know, you don't want to have a lot of candles around, and you know, to be careful. So, but I think maybe modern milling may have more of an issue with some of that than the earlier mills. But that's a little bit conjecture on my part.
I mean, I think you answered also the next question about the greatest risks as a business. Are there any other business risks associated with millers during the colonial era?
Well, like farmers, and Justin touched on a couple of them. One is drought, lack of water to run the mill, or grain failures, and then war. I mean, people get cut off, you know. And that's not just true of grain, but you think when the American Revolution happened and the French Revolution happened, huge tobacco markets are gone for a while.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I think that like anybody today, when your markets get hurt, or you're, in the case of water-powered machinery, Washington's mill sometimes only ran 6 months of the year because you didn't have enough water. So what's neat about Stratford mill and some of the mills in the Northern Neck, they're spring-fed ponds. And in fact, Robert King Carter, he was called King because he owned so much land, plantations. He was further east down the Northern Neck. And I think he's credited as one of the earliest brick houses built in Virginia. But he had a great mill that he called it, and then a smaller country mill. His great mill, the mill pond, was 50 acres. So, you know, you could grind 24/7.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, with Washington, you know, he had times when the mill was down just because
Right.
of lack of water.
I've got some requests here, and my own requests too. I would like you guys to shift a little bit. We've been talking a lot about bread, a lot about grains to eat, but let's talk about grains to distill and to turn into liquor. And I know both of you are somewhat passionate about this topic, so let's just go ahead and start that conversation. I think one of the questions we have here is, how would grains have been prepared for distilling? It's a great place to start. And another question was related to whether or not there are any contemporary brewers or distillers that are working with these heritage grains. So let's just go ahead and shift a little bit and start talking about the booze part of it.
Yeah, well, you know, obviously the making a whiskey or beer starts in a mill. So what's interesting is you have to grind that grain. How fine or coarse you grind it varies, and depending on who you talk to, you know, there's no definitive that I've seen where one way is better than the other. You know, I've talked to a lot of distillers, and you can go to some places like, you know, Scotland, where they really rip the grain really coarsely, but basically you've got to rip open those grains through milling and then take them to the distillery and do your fermentation. And with brewing as well, you know, you have to have that first step process. There are people using heirloom grains, and you know, our consulting distiller who runs Widow Jane, Lisa Wicker, she's dealt with heirloom grains in a few of her distilling jobs over the years. I think initially, perhaps with Starlight Distillery in Indiana, which grows heirlooms. And so there are definitely distilleries using them, and there's a move towards that in a lot of the craft distilling movement, which is really interesting. And so one of the goals Justin and I have working with Glenn Roberts is to not just make this bread flour, but go ahead and at Mount Vernon produce some all heirloom rye whiskeys, or even corn whiskey. So that's on our agenda. Not this year, obviously, but that's on our agenda.
And Justin, do you want to speak to the Lees and their liquor taste, or do you want me to talk a little bit about that, or should we both hit that, or what do you think?
Yeah, no. So I know the inventories of Stratford, as well as like Chantilly, Richard Henry Lee's place. There was a lot. in both the probated inventories of both like Philip Ludwell and Richard Henry Lee. Richard Henry Lee, I know probably a little bit better, and you might know Philip Ludwell maybe a little bit better. But Richard Henry, I mean, they found a ton of booze. I mean, like literally a ton. Anywhere from like West Indian rum to Arak, which is like a liquor, like a crude kind of rum. And then there was a lot of wines too, a lot of wines and Madeira. But there was like whiskey, rum, if you're talking spirits, whiskey, rum, and also brandy, lots of brandy.
Yeah.
We're actually making brandy. There's inventories of that at Chantilly in like 1780 of, you know, brandies being made at Chantilly. So that'd be like peach because there were orchards, peaches and apples. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Steve and or Kelley.
Well, definitely peach and apple brandy at Mount Vernon was made. Washington had large orchards on a couple of his farms. Also there in the Northern Neck, Nominee Hall, Robert Carter Jr. made a lot of brandy. And it's interesting in the way he operated was you have a lot of small planters, but he was a large planter like the Lees were. And oftentimes the small planter might have a small orchard. He'd get his brandy made and then he'd run out real quick. And so the larger planters became suppliers to their local people. And Robert Carter Jr. actually had his bottled. But at the end of finishing whatever you bought from him, he wanted his bottles back because he's going to use those next year. This is interesting long before bottling because you think of barrels, casks, or the old jug. But that's evidence right there near Stratford. They're bottling. It makes me wonder what Richard Henry may have been doing right down there at Chantilly or at Stratford. And, of course, at the Great House at Stratford, they have incredible wine cellars and liquor cellars in the east end of the house, and they have vaults in there. And when I worked there,
full of liquor.
I've
never seen probates in my 20 years of doing historical research that have that many, you know, of beautiful rum from the Caribbean. And, you know, to talk about Philip Ludwell Lee, he's one of my favorites to talk about because he was quite the diva. And I sort of feel like I could say that I found out recently that I am a distant cousin of many of the Lees. And so I feel a little more sort of, I don't know, comfortable talking a little bit of smack about my cousin Philip, but he was a diva. That's a different story. He actually insisted, and a lot of the probates show this and the letters show this, but they insisted that the Madeira would go from Madeira, the island of Madeira, across the equator and get nice and toasty before it came. He didn't want a regular one. He wanted to make sure that it was toasted in those barrels before it got to himself and his people, because he was very into entertaining and being the most grand host of them all. So Philip is quite a Lee character, I would have to say.
He had that yacht that he took along the cliffs.
I'm telling you, if I could go back to one period, I would go back and figure out what on earth. And, you know, Philip was the same guy, too, that insisted on having a whole horn section played on his carriage as he went through town. So, I mean, that guy, I want to go back and meet him. Pretty wild individual.
Flamboyant, yeah.
Very. I love it. I absolutely love it. Somebody asked you, Otis, were there any wineries, breweries, or distilleries at Stratford? Were distilled spirits as popular as wines in the 17th century? Why or why not? I do know that there was an attempt to make wine at Stratford, and it did not go very well. Nothing really came of it, but I don't know if you know anything else there, Steve. But
yeah, I don't think that the grape varietals they tried to plant in the colony did very well anywhere, really. So that was a struggle. But distilling is everywhere. You know, initially rum, because we were a British colony, so there were rum distilleries not far from Stratford, and the Lees actually had some interest in a distillery. And in 1781, Light Horse Harry Lee paid for repair of the gristmill to the millwright in barrels of rum. And I used to always joke, well, I hope that they did the work before they got into the rum, or the mill may not have been running well, but definitely, it, like Justin said, of even wheat and flour, it was a commodity to trade for other goods. It was legal tender like tobacco. So a lot of consumption of spirits, but certainly you could trade it for any good. And then during the Revolution is where the rum supplies are, you know, cut off, you know, the raw materials during the war, and you see whiskey really take off. Whiskey's always there, but we were a rum drinking colony until the war.
Any other questions out there? We just got through a bunch. We've got 66 people still sitting here watching.
I wanted to I wanted to answer a question that kind of
Oh yeah.
disappeared on from Jeff. It was about the French, like Le Bon Apon, the French bread. There was a high population, obviously in New France, and then spread across across the colonies. We can't really forget that sort of culture, but and kind of what I do, I try to get as many cultures involved with the bread making, but to kind of tell the story of more than 4 or 5 is a little tough depending on the site that I'm at. If I'm at Mount Vernon, obviously I'm practicing bread that was common in that area in Virginia, in the same way with like Stratford. And then when I'm in Charleston area, I usually make rice bread that has cooked middling rice that's folded back into it. And then, when I go up north, sometimes it's a bread that's cut with like cornmeal or rye, like bread. So yeah, definitely like in New France, that style of bread, it was different than what most people have seen in British North America. And then as the Revolutionary War wrapped up and we became a young country, food and grain and milling and distilling all sort of took different cultures in the aspect, and it kind of became its own melting pot of things. So thanks, Jeff, for including that, and then I can talk about that a little bit. When I say New France, I'm talking about Canada, and I'm also talking about into the French region of like Illinois and like kind of the whole way down to Louisiana.
Any other questions? Anything else you guys want to add before we close this out?
Well, I think that, if you look, we've looked at some micro areas of the history, but the macro theme is the people are people, and there's a lot of dynamic interchange that goes on just as in our culture today. And I think it's interesting to study the trade routes, the markets, the influence of different cultures, and then how that came together. And I also always say, if you don't study economic history, you're not studying history. People do things for a reason. And it seems like hard to get all those grain flours back to Europe. Well, they did it because there was money to be made. If it was no market, you're not going to take that long journey. So it's interesting to think even back then how interconnected aspects of the North American continent were with even Central and South America, because Washington even shipped flour to Suriname once.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating to find out, and back to Italy once. So, and then the other thing I think that's been really interesting is getting grounded back in original foods and original grains that go back centuries. That's what really, when I met Justin and then he turned me on to talking to Glenn at Anson Mills, it really opened up another aspect for milling for me, which we're just getting into the beginnings of it with these 2 mills. And I hope we can do more at Stratford to not only bring programs like this and the series that you've developed, Kelley, but to tell more stories through food and other aspects of milling. Because as you said early on, Justin, you get to Stratford and there's so much acreage and it's so undisturbed. You do feel like it's 1740 or 1750. And that's why if you have not been to Stratford Hall, when things are better, I encourage all of you to make the trip and go east of Fredericksburg and see the Northern Neck and see Stratford, because you won't be disappointed.
I absolutely agree. And one of the things that you brought up too is just the Atlantic world. There's an exhibit that I'm working on that's going to be ready to open sometime in the winter, hopefully by the end of November. But it's all about the Atlantic world and these cultures coming together. And I feel like, we get so wrapped up into the sort of late 18th, 19th century narrative of this country that we forget that, during the 18th century and before, even afterwards, right? That the Atlantic world was this massive highway of trade and cultures and collisions happening. And there's something very important there to tease out. And I'm hoping that these different talks we're having here over the next several months are really going to kind of start really looking into some of those different relationships, whether it's through tobacco, whether it's through food, whether it's through enslavement. All of these different things make the picture that became America. And I feel like this is a beautiful start to a program series that I'm very excited about.
Definitely.
And I want to sorry, go ahead. Before we sort of wrap it up and people start leaving, we are going to send out a survey for you all to take. And if you take the survey, we will enter your name and you will get, we're going to award, I think, 10 or so free passes. So we would love to have you come out. Also, if any of you are ever in the area, I know half of you that signed up tonight have never been on our list before, and I would absolutely love to invite you to the site. I will give you a tour. Even if you're on our list, please come see the new things we're doing at Stratford. The house looks fantastic. We put a lot of work into reinterpreting a lot of the history there, and it's really come to life. So I just want to say that. Also become a friend of Stratford. Go onto the website and do that. So I'll let we can all now sort of sum this up, but before everybody jumps off the cliff and gets off of here, I had to do that quick little plug and another huge thank you to Virginia Humanities for this particular program and for Mars for the future programs, but also to both speakers. And yeah, just you guys are fantastic, and thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any last words before we close this wonderful evening?
Well, I'm going to let Justin have the last word, but I will say, when you're in Virginia, Stratford and Mount Vernon are connected through their histories and the family's connection. So if you're in Virginia, see Stratford and come up the road and see Mount Vernon. You get to see, two interesting properties with a rich history. And, thank you for having me here. And it's always good to chat about history with Justin. So I'll leave it to you to wrap things up, my friend.
Yeah, first off, I'd like to thank Kelley and Steve. I sort of dragged Steve into this, but I knew that he'd be so awesome to get back to Stratford, and he's so excited about it. And I kind of secretly wanted to do it anyways, even if it wasn't through this program. But yeah, thank you. I mean, Stratford is such a great place, and all these Virginia places are so interconnected. When you start to look at documents, it's just everything is connected to everything. And I encourage people, once the pandemic and all this craziness is over, to please go out and see these things. You'll experience nothing like it anywhere else. And please, come see Steve at the distillery when the stuff's over, and come see me set up at Mount Vernon in the upcoming fall. And I like to travel up and down the East Coast with my oven, so I usually host events where I'm at, and I usually take regional things wherever I'm at due to the time period. So please come out and experience it, because you can read about it all you want, you can watch things, but until you're there and put yourself in that place, it's just such a spectacular site.
Thank you. I totally agree. There'll be more programs like this. So Justin, Cherry here will be doing another program in a couple of months, and he made some amazing waffles and some other things in that oven, and will be a very traditional cooking demonstration. And for those of you that are planning on tuning in next week for Dontavius Williams' African American Foodways program, I will fix the problem with the video. I don't know how, but it's going to happen. Even if I send it to you all beforehand, we're going to fix that so it doesn't affect half of you not being able to hear it. So on that note, again, thank you all. Become a friend of Stratford. Please come back to our next presentation, and thank you all so much for being here tonight.
It's been great.
Yep.
Bye now.
Hello, everybody. Good night.